Life in Judea during the 1st century was marked by a presence that permeated everything, the power of the Roman Empire. It was a domination visible on every corner, in every tax, every order, and every standard, bearing the imperial eagle that reminded everyone who truly ruled. The Jewish people lived under a system that was both military and economic, a structure designed to control, extract revenue, and stifle any attempt at rebellion. In those days, the weight of Rome was not a metaphor, it was a burden every citizen felt in their own body. Taxes were one of the most oppressive mechanisms. The Romans demanded multiple tributes: the tributum capitis, or personal tax; the tributum soli, which taxed the land, fees for transit, bridges and markets; and special levies decreed irregularly but obligatorily. The historian Flavius Josephus repeatedly described the despair these payments caused, especially in the rural regions of Galilee, where most of the population was poor. For many peasants, paying taxes meant giving up part of their harvest, going into debt, or falling into servitude. The figure of the publican mentioned in the Gospels was not simply a tax collector, he was an intermediary who often charged more than required to secure personal profit, which explained his poor reputation among the Jews. Forced labor was another stark expression of imperial domination. When Rome needed to build roads, fortresses, or aqueducts, it could requisition labor without warning. Men were taken from their homes to carry stones, dig trenches, or transport materials for exhausting hours. At times, Roman soldiers would seize pack animals or tools without compensation. The practice was so common that the Gospels alluded to it indirectly when Jesus spoke of walking the extra mile. A reference to the legal right a soldier had to compel any inhabitant to carry loads for a certain distance. It was a familiar image for those living under occupation. The military presence, for its part, was constant. Roman patrols roamed the main roads to secure peace, what is known as the Pax Romana. But their mere appearance provoked fear and silence. Legionaries were not mere guards. They had authority to detain, interrogate, punish, and if they deemed it necessary, execute anyone who challenged the established order. Crucifixion was their exemplary punishment par excellence, a form of institutional violence that we will later analyze in greater depth. Although it was reserved for criminals, slaves, and rebels, the mere sight of a crucified man served as an eternal reminder of what happened when someone dared to confront the power of the empire. Abuse by the army was an everyday risk. Soldiers could requisition food and lodging, especially during military movements. Humble households had to take in several legionaries, feed them, and tolerate their presence without complaint. Roman law allowed it. The Gospels highlight this atmosphere by mentioning the figure of the centurion, the Roman officer who supervised about 100 soldiers. A centurion represented absolute authority, and any meeting with one generated tension, although some, like the centurion of Capernaum, were described as just or compassionate in Christian tradition. Economic life was controlled by Rome, but also by local elites allied with imperial power. In Jerusalem, the family of the high priest and the Sadducees held influential positions administered with Roman approval. Although they maintained a certain religious autonomy, they depended on the Roman governor to preserve their status. The figure of Herod the Great, mentioned in the Gospels, represented the clearest example of this ambiguous alliance, a vassal king, feared and powerful, but always subordinate to the emperor. After his death, his territories were divided, and Judea came under direct Roman administration overseen by prefects such as Pontius Pilate. The fear of reprisals was a constant shadow. Any disturbance, from a protest over taxes to a conflict between religious groups, could trigger a violent military intervention. Josephus recounts episodes in which simple disputes turned into massacres due to the hasty intervention of the Roman garrison. The inhabitants knew that life could change in an instant, that an imprudent comment could lead to mass arrests, and that any suspicion of sedition, real or fabricated, was punished harshly. The administration of justice reinforced this sense of helplessness. Although the Jews had local courts, the Romans held supreme authority in cases involving serious crimes, especially those related to public order. The trial of Jesus described in the Gospels is an emblematic example. The Sanhedrin could deliberate, but the death sentence had to be approved by the Roman prefect. Pilate, the representative of Caesar, possessed the ius gladii, the right of the sword, and that power was not symbolic. The treatment of rebels was especially brutal. The Zealots, a radical Jewish group that fought to free the land of Israel, were hunted relentlessly. Any military operation against them was carried out swiftly, and their capture almost always meant torture and execution. During times of unrest, the Romans did not hesitate to destroy entire villages, burn crops, or deport entire populations. It was a deliberate strategy of terror to prevent the spark of rebellion from turning into a wildfire. For ordinary families, daily life was a struggle of silent resistance. Peasants worked lands that, in many cases, were no longer theirs, as Rome had imposed a system of redistribution that benefited loyal landowners. If a household failed to pay taxes or debts, the land could be confiscated. This forced many to become day laborers, something reflected in several parables in the Gospel of Matthew. Day laborers lived hand to mouth. If they did not find work in the morning, the family did not eat. Even in periods of relative calm, the atmosphere was tense. Censuses, like the one mentioned in the Gospel of Luke that forced Joseph and Mary to travel to Bethlehem, generated anxiety because in addition to recording the population, they served to calculate taxes and requisition labor. A census meant an increase in fiscal pressure and, in many cases, the threat of losing the little one possessed. Incurable diseases and very short life expectancy. In biblical times, disease was a constant, silent, and feared presence. Modern medical science did not exist, and most of the population lived with the certainty that any pain, sudden fever, or poorly treated wound could quickly become a death sentence. In Judea and Galilee, as in much of the ancient world, health was a fragile balance, sustained by superstition, rudimentary practices, and a deep religiosity that saw disease not only as a physical evil, but sometimes as a punishment or spiritual test. Life expectancy was extraordinarily low. The average barely exceeded 30 years, although this figure was skewed by extremely high infant mortality. Many children died before reaching the age of 5. Others did not reach 10. Exact figures vary according to archaeological sources, but all agree on a devastating picture. Childhood was the most dangerous period of human existence. A cold, prolonged diarrhea, an unexplained fever, or a dental infection could end a child's life within days. The Gospels repeatedly mention the anguish of parents over their sick children, such as the case of Jairus' daughter or the epileptic boy referred to in Mark, reflecting a universal fear. Among adults, the threat was also constant. Diseases such as tuberculosis, malaria, intestinal infections, parasites, and typhoid fever circulated unchecked. Cities, with their overcrowding and lack of sanitation, were true hotspots of contagion. Most people lived surrounded by animals, waste, contaminated wells, and garbage dumped into the streets. Drinking water, which we take for granted today, was an uncertain resource. Cisterns collected rainwater, but it was easily contaminated and often shared between people and animals. If a disease did not kill immediately, it left permanent debilitation. A respiratory infection could take weeks to resolve, leaving the patient too weak to work and condemning them to poverty. An infected wound could become gangrenous. A poorly treated sprain could incapacitate a peasant forever. There were no antibiotics, vaccines, or surgery based on antiseptic principles. Treatments consisted of ointments, herbs, religious rituals, and empirical remedies passed down through generations. Hebrew medicine, partially recorded in later rabbinic texts, was based on practical observation but completely lacked microbiological knowledge. A healer might apply oil, wine, or herbs to a wound, practices even mentioned in the parable of the Good Samaritan, but effectiveness depended more on luck than on procedure. Leprosy was one of the most feared diseases. The biblical term referred to a wide range of skin conditions, some deadly and others not, but all stigmatizing. Lepers were expelled from cities, lived in caves or remote villages, and had to announce themselves with bells or shouts to prevent healthy people from approaching. The book of Leviticus established extremely strict rules for isolation and purification. In Jesus' time, a leper was not just a patient. They were considered impure, socially dead, condemned to absolute loneliness. Catholic liturgy preserves references to these encounters in which, according to the Gospels, Jesus touched the sick without fear, something unthinkable in the society of the time. Plagues were another brutal reminder of human fragility. Locust infestations, for example, could destroy entire crops, causing famine that weakened the population and facilitated the spread of disease. Prophetic texts frequently mentioned plagues as divine signs, and they were often interpreted as punishments for collective sin. The cultural memory of the plagues of Egypt, recounted in the book of Exodus and repeated in the Passover liturgy, fueled fear of sudden catastrophes entirely beyond human control. Even the simplest causes could be potentially fatal. Pregnant women faced extreme risk of dying during childbirth due to hemorrhage, puerperal fever, or untreated complications. Maternal mortality was extremely high, and many women did not survive their third or fourth child. The Gospels and Christian tradition reference painful childbirths and women who suffered bleeding for years, such as the woman who touched Jesus' cloak seeking healing. It was a world where prolonged bleeding was a real threat to life, and subsequent weakness could leave a woman unable to work, becoming a burden on her family. The elderly formed a small group. Those who reached old age did so with bodies marked by chronic illness, bone pain, mobility problems, and partial blindness. Vision loss was so common that the blind became a frequent figure in gospel narratives. There were no glasses or cataract surgeries. An elderly person depended on their family for everything, from feeding to assistance with walking, and even a minor accident could be fatal. Understanding of disease was deeply linked to spirituality. The biology of contagion was unknown. Instead, illnesses were attributed to spirits, demons, or supernatural influences. This belief appears clearly in the exorcisms recounted in the Gospels, where people with epilepsy, mental disorders, or violent behavior were described as possessed. The sick suffered not only physically but also socially and spiritually. A condition could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, which worsened isolation. The figure of the healer was therefore crucial. Some were herbal experts, others performed religious rituals. There were also practitioners who combined medical practices with magical formulas. The act of partially healing or relieving pain was considered divine work. Prophets of the Old Testament, the priestly tradition, and later Jesus and his disciples held a symbolic role in this landscape of despair, offering something no human doctor could guarantee: hope. Intestinal diseases were particularly common due to contaminated water and food. Most people's diets consisted of bread, oil, dried fish, and staples that could spoil quickly. Without refrigeration and with poor hygiene, food poisoning was an everyday risk. Wells and cisterns could be contaminated with animal carcasses or human waste, causing sudden outbreaks of severe diarrhea, something frequent in warm regions like Judea. Parasitic infections were endemic. Intestinal worms, lice, and fleas affected nearly the entire population. Children with lower resistance suffered chronic malnutrition, bloated bellies, and persistent weakness. Many did not survive their first decade of life. Infant burials found in archaeological excavations in Galilee and the Jordan Valley reveal this harsh reality, which rarely appears in written texts but profoundly shaped the human experience of the time. People also lived with constant fear of accidental injuries. Agricultural work, fishing, and carpentry caused cuts and blows that could easily become infected. There were no sterile bandages, and the concept of disinfection was unknown. A deep splinter or animal bite could trigger infectious trismus, what we now know as tetanus. Death from muscle spasms and unbearable pain was a scene many had witnessed firsthand or in their villages. Care of the dead was another source of infection. Houses were small, and embalming practices like those in Egypt did not exist. Bodies had to be buried quickly to avoid decomposition inside the home. Everyday violence, stonings, crucifixions, and public executions, life in biblical times was marked by violence so common that it became a natural part of the everyday landscape. In Judea, Galilee, and the cities of the eastern Mediterranean, public punishment was not the exception but a regular mechanism to maintain order in a society without prison systems like those we have today. Jail was not conceived as a place of rehabilitation. It was merely a temporary space for detention before a swift trial and often an irreversible sentence. Justice was applied visibly, exemplarily, and cruelly, sending a simple message: authority must be feared. Stoning was one of the oldest and most entrenched punishments. According to Mosaic law recorded in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, certain offenses such as blasphemy, adultery, or idolatry could be punished by throwing stones until the guilty party died. This method was not exclusive to the Hebrews. It existed in numerous ancient cultures, but in Judea it carried deep symbolic weight. When a group stoned a person, It was a communal act. Society as a whole executed the sentence. The account of the woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John alludes to this practice when it mentions that those accusing her already held stones in their hands, ready to enforce the law. Stoning represented collective death, the judgment of the group over the individual, and few images were as terrifying for those living under the constant threat of accusation. The violence associated with public punishment did not end there. Roman scourging was one of the most brutal methods ever devised, and its use was widespread throughout the empire. The flagrum, the Roman whip, consisted of several leather strands reinforced with bones, metal, or lead balls. Blow after blow tore the skin, breaking muscles and blood vessels. Many condemned people died during the scourging, even before receiving a final sentence. The Gospels mention that Jesus was scourged before the crucifixion, a fact preserved with enormous symbolic significance in Catholic liturgy, but historically, it was a routine procedure for prisoners considered dangerous or rebellious. Crucifixion was undoubtedly the most feared punishment in the ancient world. This method, probably originating among the Assyrians or Persians and perfected by the Romans, was designed not only to kill, but to humiliate and prolong suffering. The victim was nailed or tied to a crossbeam, with arms extended and legs secured to prevent movement. Death could occur from slow asphyxiation, traumatic shock, dehydration, or multiple organ failure. The crucified remained exposed for hours or even days, serving as a warning to anyone daring to challenge imperial power. The sight of a row of crosses along the approaches to a city was not uncommon, and their mere presence kept the population in a permanent state of obedience. Rome used crucifixion to punish specific crimes: rebellion, desertion, treason, and offenses committed by slaves. Death by crucifixion was public and intended to be witnessed by as many people as possible. There was no privacy in execution. It was, by definition, a spectacle. The Roman historian Tacitus mentions that provincial governors resorted to this punishment to suppress uprisings or punish insurgent leaders. In Judea, where anti-Roman sentiment ran deep, crucifixion became a symbol of occupation. Anyone passing near Golgotha, where executions took place in Jerusalem, knew that life could end hanging from a cross without a proper burial and with vultures circling above. Everyday violence was not limited to official punishments. Cities and villages frequently witnessed disputes, brawls, and lynchings. Family or tribal conflicts could end in rapid deaths without intervention from authorities. In a world where the law was applied unevenly and impunity was common, many problems were resolved through force. The lack of permanent police structures beyond Roman patrols meant that local justice depended on elders, improvised judges, or community leaders. A serious accusation could provoke immediate violent reactions. In this context, the concept of family and tribal honor played a crucial role, and offenses considered insulting demanded proportional responses to maintain the group's prestige. There were also communal executions not authorized by Roman law but tolerated when they did not affect public stability. The spontaneous stoning of certain accused individuals was difficult to control, and although Rome prohibited the application of the death penalty without the governor's authorization, local tensions could provoke scenes of uncontrollable violence. In the Acts of the Apostles, the stoning of Stephen, one of the first Christians, illustrates how community justice could prevail even under imperial supervision. Minor corporal punishments completed the picture. People caught stealing grain, livestock, or tools could be publicly beaten. Offenders of lesser crimes could receive lashes in squares or markets. Violence was a cultural language. Teaching discipline required showing pain. Family education did not escape this logic. The wisdom texts of the Old Testament mention the rod as an instrument of correction, reflecting a view in which authority was reinforced through blows. Society was structured around harsh hierarchies, where the weakest, children, women, the elderly, and slaves, lived constantly under the shadow of punishment. The Romans also carried out executions by beheading, especially for Roman citizens accused of serious crimes. This method was considered more humane because it caused a rapid death, but was a legal privilege reserved for a minority. Non-citizens were exposed to more cruel methods. In cases of sedition, Rome applied collective punishments: village destruction, property confiscation, deportations, and mass crucifixions. After the death of Herod the Great, revolts in Jerusalem and Galilee triggered repression so severe that hundreds were executed as a deterrent. Slaves suffered even greater violence. A master could punish them without judicial intervention, from lashes to mutilations. Roman law recognized slaves as property, not people. If a slave escaped, they could be branded with a hot iron. If they attacked their master, execution was carried out without discussion. This institutionalized brutality also extended to domestic slaves, day laborers, or temporary workers. The reality of the time made it clear that human life did not have the same value for everyone. In places like Jerusalem, where different religious groups competed for influence, ritual violence was also part of the environment. The Zealots killed Roman collaborators using hidden daggers called sicae, which gave rise to the term sicare. These actions provoked immediate reprisals from the authorities. Streets could transform into chaotic scenes where soldiers, insurgents, and civilians mixed in collective panic. Extreme poverty in Judea and Galilee. Life in Judea and Galilee was marked by poverty that cut across almost all social strata, except for a privileged minority connected to the temple, urban elites, or the Roman administration. The everyday landscape was that of a rural society, with small villages built from limestone and mud, where most people survived on barely enough, relying on fragile agriculture subject to climate, the land, and taxes. It was a world where the margin between life and death could depend on a single harvest, a late rain, or an unexpected plague. Families lived in small, single-room houses where parents, children, small animals, and work tools were all concentrated. These homes lacked large windows, partly to keep the interior cool during hot months, but also because glass was an unattainable luxury. Floors were usually compacted earth, and roofs made of branches and hardened mud required constant maintenance. A strong storm could destroy them, leaving the family exposed to the elements for weeks. The Bible frequently mentions the humble homes of fishermen and peasants in Galilee, such as Simon Peter's house in Capernaum, a modest space reflecting the region's reality. Hunger was a constant visitor. The common diet consisted of barley bread, olive oil, figs, dates, and in inland areas a minimal amount of dried fish or goat cheese. Meat was almost a luxury, consumed only during religious festivals or important community events. When Jesus multiplied the loaves and fish, the gesture had a profound impact precisely because access to food in quantity was extremely limited for most people. Peasants lived with constant worry. If the harvest failed, there were no reserves. Famines were recurrent, exacerbated by droughts, plagues, or political decisions that prioritized Roman tribute over local survival. Agricultural labor was brutal. Peasants tilled the land with rudimentary tools, often inherited or improvised. The plow consisted of a reinforced log pulled by a pair of oxen. Men, women, and children worked long hours under the intense sun. Sowing and harvesting were critical moments, full of anxiety. The parable of the sower mentioned in the Gospels reflects this extreme vulnerability. Seeds falling on hard ground, among thorns, or by the roadside symbolize a world where nature was unpredictable and failure could mean death. Access to water was another constant challenge. In many villages, the only source was a communal well where women and girls queued for long periods to fill clay jars. A dry well meant an immediate crisis. Biblical episodes, such as Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well in Sychar, highlight the social dimension of water, a resource as essential as it was fragile, around which daily routines, physical effort, and hope revolved. Occasionally, cisterns storing rainwater were easily contaminated, causing diseases that further weakened an already fragile population. Galilee, although fertile in some areas, was not a place of guaranteed abundance. The main crops depended on climate cycles that could fail. In years of irregular rainfall, yields plummeted. Farmers lived in fear of losing crops to sudden storms, insect invasions, or plant diseases. The loss of a harvest could force families to sell animals, tools, or even family members as slaves to pay debts, a reality mentioned in the Book of Kings when a prophet's widow faced creditors threatening to take her children as payment. In villages, bartering was as common as money. Roman coins were used mainly to pay taxes, while daily trade relied on direct exchanges, flour for oil, goats for cloth, labor for grain. Weekly fairs were essential events where peasants, artisans, and fishermen gathered to sell their products. Prices fluctuated according to supply and demand, but always under the shadow of Roman taxes, which levied every transaction. Tax collectors could appear at any moment to demand extra payments, and no one was sure their possessions would be enough. Clothing was a clear symbol of poverty. Most people owned one or two linen or wool tunics and possibly a heavy cloak for cold nights. The Bible mentions the cloak as an object so valuable it could even serve as collateral for a debt, provided it was returned to the owner before sunset to prevent death from cold. This detail reflects the extreme precariousness of the population. Losing a garment could be a tragedy. The lives of fishermen, especially around the Sea of Galilee, were also marked by poverty. Although the lake was rich in resources, fishing was heavily taxed, requiring fishermen to give part of their catch to Roman or local officials. Nets tore easily and required constant repair, and sudden storms could destroy entire boats. The Gospels describe occasions when Jesus' disciples fished all night without catching anything, a direct reflection of a fragile economy where even established trades could not guarantee daily sustenance. The role of women, without rights and in constant danger. In biblical times, women's lives were marked by extreme vulnerability. From childhood, their destiny was determined by the decisions of others, and their place in society was defined by traditions that had been established over centuries. They had no political rights, could not testify in most trials, and rarely controlled their own property. The patriarchal structure dominating Judea, Galilee, and the rest of the Middle East was so rigid that even the legal texts of the Old Testament assumed that a woman always lived under the authority of a man, first her father, then her husband, and in old age, her sons. Marriage was the universal norm and occurred at surprisingly young ages. Many girls were betrothed before the age of 12 and could marry shortly afterward. For poor families, giving a daughter in marriage was an act of survival. The dowry, usually consisting of animals, clothing, utensils, or money, temporarily alleviated the household's economic burden. Women had no right to choose their husbands. Marriages were agreements between families, negotiations in which their voice was almost non-existent. Christian liturgy preserves the memory of these customs in accounts such as Mary and Joseph, where the marital engagement preceded cohabitation and had a legal character that could only be broken through formal repudiation. Once married, a woman moved into her husband's household under the supervision of her mother-in-law or other women of the extended family. The home functioned as a hierarchical microstructure. The youngest wife occupied the lowest rung and assumed the most exhausting tasks. Women ground grain, kneaded bread, carried water from the well, wove, tended small animals, and cared for children. Their day began before dawn and ended after sunset. With no modern machinery, simple tasks, grinding grain or washing clothes in a stream, took hours, and physical exhaustion was constant. Pregnancy and childbirth posed enormous risks. Maternal mortality was so high that a woman could die during her first delivery or remain permanently weakened. Postpartum infections, hemorrhages, and obstructed labor claimed the lives of thousands of women each generation. Biblical tradition records the pain of motherhood in passages such as the punishment of Eve in Genesis, which mentions pain in childbirth as an inevitable reality. This was not a poetic metaphor, but a description of the most feared experience for women of the time. If a woman could not bear children, her position in the household was in jeopardy. Infertility was seen as a misfortune, a sign of absent divine favor, and often justified the husband taking a second wife or concubine. The stories of Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah reflect the suffering caused by the inability to conceive in a culture where male offspring were essential to preserve family inheritance. Social pressure on infertile women could lead to marginalization or repudiation. Repudiation was a legal form of ending a marriage. Although Mosaic law provided certain regulations, the practice was largely in the hands of the husband, who could issue a divorce certificate and dismiss his wife. A repudiated woman found herself in a desperate situation, unprotected, without resources, and with no stable place in the community. The Gospels mention this custom when Jesus criticizes the ease with which some men used it, highlighting the hardness of heart behind such decisions. Historically, repudiation exposed women to hunger, begging, or, in extreme cases, prostitution. Women also faced constant risk of physical violence. The law of the time allowed husbands to discipline their wives, and domestic abuse rarely received social condemnation. If a woman was accused of adultery, even without strong evidence, she could be stoned. Female adultery was considered a grave offense because it threatened the legitimacy of heirs, while male infidelity had fewer consequences. The inequality in punishment was stark. The story of the adulterous woman, almost stoned before Jesus intervened, illustrates how swiftly punishment could be applied. In public, women lived under strict norms. They had to cover their hair, wear modest clothing, and avoid behaviors that could be interpreted as provocative. Speaking with unknown men could be considered inappropriate. In many regions, they could not participate in public discussions or access political life. Their presence in religious spaces was also limited. In the Temple of Jerusalem, there was a specific courtyard called the Women's Court, further from the central altar and without access to rituals reserved for men. This spatial segregation reflected a social order where women were considered ritually impure during certain cycles and thus restricted in their relationship with the sacred. In villages, women's lives were intertwined with other women. Communal tasks became spaces where they shared experiences, fears, and hopes. However, female solidarity did not fully protect against danger. In times of conflict, women were considered spoils of war. Romans, bandits, mercenaries, and insurgent groups saw them as objects of domination. Sexual vulnerability was a constant threat, especially in regions with a continuous military presence. Historical sources, including the writings of Flavius Josephus, describe episodes of sexual violence committed during Roman raids on rebellious villages. Poor women were doubly vulnerable to male violence and economic hardship. Their lives depended on hard work and the favor of the men in their families. Widowhood was an especially dangerous tragedy. A woman without a husband was exposed to abuse, dispossession, and debt. For this reason, Mosaic law established the practice of levirate marriage, in which a widow married her deceased husband's brother to ensure she was not abandoned. This mechanism illustrates a society where women's protection depended entirely on their inclusion in a male-headed household. Religious tensions, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and Romans. In biblical times, daily life was permeated by religious tensions so deep that they shaped every aspect of existence, from what people ate to how they greeted, walked, prayed, or worked. Judea and Galilee were not merely provinces of the Roman Empire, they were territories where religion determined identity, law, politics, and social structure. Inevitably, religion itself became a field of fierce dispute among different groups, each convinced they were the legitimate guardian of God's will. The Pharisees occupied a central place in this religious landscape. They were a movement of rigorists, scholars of the law, the Torah, who believed that strict observance of the commandments was the key to preserving Israelite identity under foreign occupation. Their roots traced back to the time of the Maccabees, and their influence extended across synagogues, villages, and marketplaces. For them, ritual purity, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and careful interpretation of Scripture were essential. The oral tradition, later codified in the Talmud, guided every detail of life, from hand-washing to the binding of phylacteries. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead and in angels, generating tensions with groups that rejected these doctrines. The Sadducees, by contrast, were the religious and political elite associated with the Jerusalem temple. They belonged to priestly and aristocratic families that had maintained control of the cult for generations. Unlike the Pharisees, the Sadducees did not accept the oral tradition. They recognized only the authority of the written law. They did not believe in resurrection or in angels or spirits in the Pharisaic sense. Their main concern was preserving the temple, the hierarchical structure, and social stability, even if this required partial collaboration with the Romans. For them, ritual sacrifice in the temple was the heart of the faith, and any threat to this institution, whether religious or political, had to be controlled without hesitation. The Essenes formed a smaller but influential group. They lived in separate communities, such as the famous settlement at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. They considered themselves the faithful remnant, a pure group that had fled the corruption of the temple to await the coming of the Messiah. They practiced purification rituals, led austere lives, and maintained strict behavioral norms. Although they do not appear directly in the Gospels, their presence contributed to the spiritual climate of the first century, a context in which many expected an imminent change, a divine intervention to restore justice. The Zealots introduced an even more explosive element into the mix. They were a radical, deeply nationalist movement that saw armed resistance as a religious duty. To them, paying taxes to Rome was collaborating with the oppressor and therefore an act of treason. They accepted no power over Israel except God's. Within their faction was an even more extreme group, the sicari, named for the curved daggers, sicae, they hid in their clothing. They attacked Romans and Jews considered traitors, even during festivals or in the temple itself. Their presence instilled fear in both local and Roman authorities and contributed decades later to the revolt that culminated in the temple's destruction in 70 CE. This mosaic of religious groups coexisted under the shadow of the Roman Empire, whose absolute power constrained any internal disputes. Roman governors, like Pontius Pilate, tolerated a certain degree of religious autonomy as long as public order was not threatened. Yet the combination of theological tension, economic inequality, and messianic fervor made stability fragile. Every major festival, especially Passover, celebrating Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt, was viewed by Rome as a moment of potential danger. Thousands of pilgrims arrived in Jerusalem. Religious fervor surged, messianic expectations intensified, and the zealots took advantage of the crowds to provoke disturbances. Synagogues, present in nearly every village, were centers of assembly where these disputes resonated. They were not merely religious spaces, they were community forums where tensions between Pharisees and other groups could escalate. In some towns, Pharisaic influence was dominant. In others, the Sadducees maintained some control through wealthy families. This internal diversity made it impossible to speak of a single form of first-century Judaism. Multiple versions of the faith coexisted. The arrival of an itinerant preacher could completely disrupt local tranquility. Teachers and prophets were common, each attracting followers and controversy. The figure of Jesus fits into this panorama of doctrinal tension and political oppression. His preaching about the kingdom of God, his closeness to the poor, and his criticism of religious leaders placed him at the center of a theological storm that ultimately led to his arrest and execution. The confrontation between Jesus and certain Pharisaic or priestly groups described in the Gospels reflects real conflicts, though it must also be understood in the context of the Christian communities that later compiled these texts. Spiritual life, possessions, exorcisms, and supernatural beliefs. In biblical times, spiritual life was inseparably connected to an invisible world that the inhabitants of Judea and Galilee considered as real as the physical one. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was blurred, and people interpreted everyday phenomena as signs of spiritual forces at work. The scriptures spoke of angels, demons, and spirits, and these narratives were part of daily life, shaping how people understood their own suffering and hope. Spiritual evil was a constant concern. Belief in demons was deeply rooted in late Hebrew tradition and intensified during the intertestamental period, when Persian, Hellenistic, and Mesopotamian influences merged with Jewish thought. Biblical texts described Satan as adversary, accuser, and tempter, a figure appearing in stories as old as the Book of Job, and later gaining a clearer role as a spiritual enemy in the Gospels. This framework allowed many human experiences, from illnesses to nervous attacks, to be interpreted as demonic possession. Accounts of possession reflected the anxiety of a society lacking medical explanations for neurological or psychological disorders. People suffering from epilepsy, convulsions, panic attacks, mental disorders, or violent behavior were considered under demonic influence. The Gospel of Mark mentions the Gerasene demoniac, a man living among tombs, injuring himself with stones and displaying uncontrollable strength. Such behavior caused fear and social isolation. The possessed were marginalized, living in caves or on the outskirts of villages, and only attended to when their families reached the limits of desperation. Exorcism was a respected but feared profession. Exorcists could be priests, teachers of the law, or itinerant healers. They used prayers, invocations of God's name, laying on of hands, amulets, or ritual formulas to expel evil spirits. First-century Judaism had very ancient exorcism traditions, some mentioned in texts such as the Book of Tobit, where the angel Raphael instructs how to expel a demon. In Jesus' time, exorcists were well-known figures, and their ability to free the possessed was considered a sign of spiritual authority. The Gospels recount numerous exorcisms performed by Jesus, demonstrating the normality of these practices in religious life. Fear of impure spirits also extended to abandoned places. Deserts, ruins, and cemeteries were seen as inhabited by demons or wandering souls. The Judean desert, an arid and seemingly endless expanse, was considered a territory of spiritual solitude where one could confront both God and evil. When Jesus was led into the desert to be tempted by the devil, according to the Gospels, this scene resonated with the collective imagination of a people who viewed that environment as a stage for invisible battles. Homes could be subjected to protective rituals. Hanging amulets, inscribing passages from the Torah, or performing purifications with water or oil were common practices. In many villages, certain objects were believed to bring good luck, such as white stones or fragments of ancient vessels. The line between superstition and religion was thin, especially among the common people. In addition to demons, angels held a significant place in spiritual imagination. Hebrew tradition described them as messengers and protectors. The Book of Daniel contains some of the most detailed descriptions, with figures such as Michael and Gabriel. In contemporary liturgy, angels were perceived as intermediaries between God and humans. The Annunciation to Mary in the Gospel of Luke, delivered by the angel Gabriel, reflects this sensitivity and the deep conviction that the spiritual world intervened directly in human affairs. Dreams played an essential role in interpreting reality. God was believed to speak through them, and many important decisions were based on nocturnal visions. Joseph, husband of Mary, receives instructions in dreams on multiple occasions to flee to Egypt, return to Israel, or avoid Judea. These narratives reflect a culture in which the dream world held almost prophetic authority. In an era without psychology or sleep science, a vision could change the course of a family or an entire community. Healers were also part of the spiritual landscape. Some were experts in herbs and natural remedies, others combined rudimentary medicine with religious rituals. Public healings drew crowds. People sought relief from chronic illnesses, blindness, paralysis, or mysterious ailments. The Gospels describe crowds surrounding Jesus, seeking miracles, but this scene was not exclusive to nascent Christianity. Across the ancient world, men and women were considered saints, prophets, or thaumaturges capable of invoking divine power to heal. The use of amulets and protective objects was not always approved by religious authorities. The Pharisees, for example, criticized practices they considered a mixture with pagan customs. But for ordinary people, the need for protection outweighed theological debate. In a culture where life hung by a thread, people sought security wherever it could be found, whether in the law, in prayer, or in an amulet hung around the neck. Curses and blessings carried real weight in society. A blessing pronounced by a priest or teacher could be considered a spiritual shield. Conversely, a curse uttered by a respected person could provoke fear and social impact. Belief in the power of the spoken word was strong. A declaration could transform a person's fate. The episode of Jesus cursing the fig tree, according to the Gospel of Mark, shows how such actions resonated deeply in people's perception of spiritual authority. The struggle between good and evil was not merely a religious concept, it was a daily experience for those living amid disease, poverty, and violence. People saw signs of that battle everywhere. In an unexpected storm, in an illness that appeared without warning, in a disturbing dream, or in strange behavior no one could explain. The spiritual world provided a narrative that gave meaning to suffering. If something went wrong, it was because dark forces were at work. If something was resolved, it was because God had intervened. Even ordinary objects were imbued with spiritual symbolism. Olive oil, for example, was not only used for cooking. It was applied to anoint the sick and injured as a sign of divine protection. Mezuzot, small boxes containing sacred texts placed on doorframes, protected homes. Ritual garments, such as the fringed cloak worn by devout men, reminded people of the need to follow the commandments. Everything spoke, everything pointed, everything reminded that the spiritual world was always present. Dangerous and low-paying jobs. In biblical times, survival depended on occupations that demanded strength, endurance, and a tolerance for danger that would be unimaginable today. The vast majority of the population in Judea and Galilee worked in manual labor, harsh and poorly paid, where an accident could mean not only the loss of livelihood but death. There were no unions, insurance, or protective tools. Trades were passed down from parents to children, and each carried specific risks that society accepted as inevitable. Among the most common jobs was farming, which required long hours under a relentless sun. Peasants cultivated wheat, barley, figs, olives, and grapes using rudimentary tools. Physical strength was essential, as well as heat endurance and the ability to work with little rest. Plowing the land with oxen involved constant danger from blows, sprains, bites, or accidents with the animals. Carrying heavy loads from the fields to the village caused permanent back injuries. The Bible repeatedly mentions the hardships of farmers, and many of Jesus' parables describe agricultural settings where work, fatigue, and uncertainty dominated daily life. The occupation of shepherd also represented considerable risk. Shepherds lived outdoors, exposed to cold nights, sudden storms, and the constant threat of wolves, bears, or bandits. Psalm 23 evokes divine protection with the metaphor of the shepherd precisely because this work required guarding the animals with courage and sacrifice. In places like the Judean desert, keeping a flock together meant constantly moving in search of water and pasture. A single lapse could result in the loss of several sheep, causing severe economic consequences. Shepherds slept on the ground, ate little, and led an isolated life, accompanied only by animals and danger. Fishermen, especially on the Sea of Galilee, faced different threats. Navigating in small wooden boats on a lake known for sudden storms was extremely dangerous. A storm could form in minutes due to the region's topography, generating strong gusts of wind. Waves struck with force and could capsize boats. The Gospel of Mark recounts how a storm nearly sank the disciples' boat, an episode reflecting the real fear that fishermen experienced daily. Additionally, heavy nets caused arm and hand injuries, and dragging in the catch required extraordinary strength. The constant smell of fish, combined with cold nights, caused respiratory illnesses that affected many fishermen at an early age. In towns and villages, artisans performed trades that also carried risks. Carpenters, like Joseph, Jesus' father according to Christian tradition, worked with simple tools and no protection. A deep cut could become infected and turn into a deadly threat. Blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and utensils under the intense heat of makeshift furnaces. They inhaled smoke and hazardous particles while handling red-hot metals, and a misdirected spark could burn their skin or eyes. The lack of thick cloths, gloves, or protective goggles meant these trades frequently caused deformities, scars, and partial blindness. Masons and builders faced other dangers. They built stone walls without harnesses, sturdy ladders, or safe scaffolding. They worked at unstable heights, carried heavy blocks, and mixed mud with their feet. Falls were common and, in an era without adequate medical treatment, almost always fatal. Judea was constantly under construction. Towers, walls, houses, and roads. The Roman Empire demanded continuous repairs to its infrastructure and did not hesitate to recruit local labor for these tasks. For many men, construction was not a chosen trade but an imposed obligation. Day laborers lived in even greater insecurity. They were temporary workers hoping to be hired for a single day. They gathered in town squares or at village entrances at dawn, hoping a landowner would call them. If they did not get work, they earned no money, and if they earned no money, their families went hungry. Jesus mentions these laborers in several parables, showing the anxiety they felt as the day progressed without employment. For them, each dawn was a desperate gamble for survival. Porters were men who offered their physical strength to transport goods in markets and along roads. Carrying sacks of grain, jars of oil, wood or stones quickly wore out the body. Hernias, spinal problems, and muscle injuries were inevitable. In large cities like Jerusalem, this occupation was particularly common due to the constant flow of pilgrims arriving for religious festivals. A particularly harsh job was that of water carriers. Many villages with water shortages depended on these men, who carried huge jars from nearby wells or springs to homes. They walked kilometers under the sun, climbing and descending hills, sometimes suffering blows or theft. The Bible occasionally mentions water carriers as part of urban and rural life, reflecting the importance of this arduous and anonymous work. Tanners and leather workers faced unbearable odors and toxic substances. They worked with animal hides in various stages of decay, immersing the pieces in lime, salt, vinegar, and other corrosive agents. Their workshops were relegated to the outskirts of towns due to the stench they produced. Tanners were socially excluded as their trade was considered impure. Jewish soldiers serving Herod or the Romans faced their own dangers. Although they had access to food and a steady salary, they faced severe punishments if they failed in their duties. They were often sent to quell uprisings or guard roads, where they could be ambushed. Serving the Roman power also created internal tensions, as many compatriots considered those who collaborated with the occupiers to be traitors. The road to Jerusalem, pilgrimage, bandits, and death on the roads. Traveling in biblical times was a dangerous, exhausting, and often deadly undertaking. The routes connecting the villages of Galilee and Judea to Jerusalem were crowded with pilgrims, merchants, and temporary workers walking long distances on foot. But these roads, far from being safe, were filled with threats, bandits lurking on the hills, wild animals, impatient Roman soldiers, and weather conditions capable of turning a journey into a desperate struggle for survival. The trip to Jerusalem was a religious duty, but also a physical and spiritual test that not everyone could complete. The most traveled route connected Galilee with Judea through the Jordan Valley. To avoid Samaritan territory, where ethnic and religious tensions could spark violent confrontations, many pilgrims preferred to walk through arid and isolated areas. Others, more daring or with fewer resources, risked crossing Samaria and relying on the goodwill of its inhabitants. The Gospel of Luke mentions the mutual disdain between Jews and Samaritans, evidence of a conflict that added another layer of difficulty to the journey. Caravans were essential. People traveled in groups for safety. Each caravan included families, merchants with donkeys or camels, the elderly, children, and pack animals. Those who traveled alone were seen as suicidal. Roman authorities did not patrol all routes. They only protected main roads or strategic areas. Secondary paths, ravines, and hills were fertile ground for bands of thieves who knew the terrain well. The famous parable of the Good Samaritan, which describes a man assaulted and left half dead on a lonely road, reflected a reality so common that listeners needed no explanation to imagine the scene. Bandits operated with precision. Some worked in small groups, launching quick ambushes. Others belonged to larger networks that extorted merchants or controlled mountain passes. Travelers were stripped of clothing, food, money, and animals. If they resisted, they could be injured or killed without mercy. Many villages had stories of relatives who never returned from a trip to Jerusalem, bodies that were never found, and rumors that the mountains hid more anonymous graves than plants. Flavius Josephus repeatedly mentions the presence of bandits on the roads of Judea, especially on the road to Jericho, famous for its narrow gorges where no one could escape an ambush. Geography amplified the danger. The desert hills around the Jordan offered perfect hiding spots. Deep ravines could trap a person with no chance of help. In summer, scorching heat caused dehydration. In winter, cold temperatures could freeze unprepared travelers. Sudden storms could flood ravines and sweep away entire caravans. The lack of potable water forced travelers to ration every drop. Those traveling with children or the elderly suffered particularly. Many stopped at springs and wells, but these locations were also watched by thieves waiting for exhausted travelers. Pilgrims ascending to Jerusalem for Passover, Shavuot, or Sukkot faced crowded yet equally unsafe roads. Romans increased surveillance during major festivals, fearing disturbances or revolts, but their presence did not eliminate the threat of criminals. Centurions patrolling certain stretches were feared as much as the bandits, as they could requisition animals, provisions, or impose punishments arbitrarily. Roman authorities viewed caravans with suspicion. Thousands of moving Jews could, in their eyes, become a political threat. Inns, called katalimata, offered temporary rest, but were also not safe. There was no regulation. Some were traps run by people collaborating with bandits. A traveler could be robbed while sleeping or poisoned for their belongings. Jesus and his disciples were familiar with these difficulties. The Gospel of Luke mentions the challenge of finding lodging for Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem, reflecting the overcrowding and precariousness of these places. Those with money could pay for rooms in private homes, but most slept in open courtyards or makeshift stables exposed to cold and insects. The roads were also full of bureaucrats and toll collectors. Rome imposed taxes for crossing certain bridges or entering specific regions. Publicans stationed themselves strategically along trade routes to collect excessive fees. Many merchants preferred longer, more dangerous routes to avoid these posts, increasing the likelihood of encountering bandits. This system punished the poor and enriched those controlling commerce or collaborating with the empire. Wild animals added another threat. In the forested northern areas, bears and wolves could attack lone travelers. In desert areas, venomous snakes and scorpions were constant dangers. Shepherds knew these risks better than anyone, but for families on pilgrimage, a bite or sting could be fatal before reaching a village where help was available. Children were especially vulnerable, and many local stories recount tragedies in the middle of nowhere, where no one heard their cries. Despite the danger, pilgrimage to Jerusalem was a deeply rooted religious duty. The Psalms of Ascents, including Psalm 121, which begins, "I lift up my eyes to the hills," were sung along the journey. These songs expressed the travelers' fear and hope, mountains hiding enemies, dark nights, and at the same time, trust that God would protect their path. The journey carried a spiritual meaning that filled pilgrims with determination. Reaching Jerusalem meant more than fulfilling a ritual. It was an act of national and religious identity. The route to the Holy City was marked by recognizable stations, springs, improvised camps, hills from which the temple could be seen in the distance. As pilgrims approached, their hearts raced. For many, it was the most important journey of their lives. Jerusalem represented the center of the spiritual world, the place where God had set his name. To reach it, they crossed rivers, deserts, and mountains, risking their lives without hesitation. But not all arrived. Many died on the way and were buried in makeshift graves, marked with stones or branches. Their families continued the journey in sorrow, convinced it was God's will. Caravans avoided lingering too long near these improvised tombs. Recent deaths were considered impure under Mosaic law, and accidental contact could prevent participation in temple rituals. Thus, even in the deepest devotion, fear and the need to fulfill the law were intertwined. Slavery as a normal part of society. In biblical times, slavery was not only common, it was a structural component of society, accepted as a natural fact of life. In Judea, Galilee, and throughout the Roman Empire, being a slave meant living without freedom, without control over one's own body, and at the absolute mercy of the master. This reality, as cruel as it was commonplace, defined the experience of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children who worked, suffered, and died without leaving a trace of their stories. Law, economy, and culture legitimized this practice, making it an institution as old as it was entrenched. Early references to slavery appear even in the texts of the Old Testament. Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy mention rules regulating the treatment of Hebrew and foreign slaves, indicating that their existence was considered a natural part of the social landscape. Hebrews could fall into slavery due to debt, extreme poverty, or as a consequence of war. They could also acquire foreign slaves, especially prisoners from other peoples. These laws aimed to limit certain abuses, but the system remained profoundly unequal. Slaves were still the property of their masters, both in Israel and under Roman rule. By the time of Jesus, slavery had taken on the most complex forms developed by Rome. The expansion of the empire had created a massive market for slaves from diverse regions: Gauls, Thracians, Egyptians, Syrians, Numidians, and occasionally Jews captured in conflicts. Rome viewed slaves as economic and social resources, fundamental pieces in the imperial machinery. Slaves worked in households, workshops, mines, fields, ports, and sometimes even as administrators or educators. However, the harshest jobs, such as mines or large estates, had mortality rates so high that masters did not bother with their welfare. In Judea, slavery had particular characteristics. Extreme poverty forced some to sell themselves temporarily as slaves to pay debts or avoid famine. Creditors could take children as collateral or temporary servants. This type of domestic slavery was common in rural villages, and although regulated by Hebrew law, it remained a tragic fate for those who fell into it. The Book of Kings mentions a widow who fears her children will be taken as slaves by a creditor, a clear reflection of the constant danger facing the poor. Slaves lived at the margins of all rights. Their lives depended entirely on the master's will. They could be sold, punished, abandoned, or used without significant legal consequences. The Romans distinguished between domestic slaves who lived inside the master's house and rural slaves who worked under much harsher conditions. Domestic slaves sometimes developed complex relationships with their masters based on closeness, usefulness, or dependency. However, this did not eliminate their vulnerability. A master could decide their fate in an instant. The Bible references these dynamics in parables where masters and servants represent hierarchical relationships marked by fear and obedience. Rural slaves endured the most extreme conditions. They worked from before dawn until after dusk, cultivating lands that were not their own and enduring frequent punishments. Overseers monitored every movement, and a single mistake could trigger lashes or reduced rations. Romans considered the productivity of a rural slave dependent on strict discipline. Mines were even worse. Narrow tunnels, foul air, constant collapses, and endless workdays turned these places into living tombs. Many slaves died without seeing sunlight for weeks. Female slaves suffered doubly. In addition to performing heavy domestic labor, they were exposed to sexual abuse by masters, the master's sons, or even visitors. Roman law did not protect a female slave from rape. Her body was considered property. Many became pregnant and gave birth to children who also became slaves. Female slavery was marked by nearly invisible yet deeply cruel suffering. These women lived in constant fear, knowing their fate could change overnight at the capricious will of a man. Slaves born within a household had a slight advantage. They knew their masters from birth and could gain some trust. Still, their lives were determined by rules of absolute obedience. A slave could be sold far from home without notice, permanently separated from family. Slave markets operated routinely like any fair. Slaves' bodies were inspected, their strength evaluated, and their price negotiated. Children were especially valued because they could be shaped according to the master's needs. In the Gospels, there are frequent references to slaves and servants, showing how normalized this institution was. Jesus told parables in which servants represented obedience, responsibility, or punishment, as in the parable of the talents or the watchful servant. These references did not promote slavery but used it as a conceptual framework familiar to all listeners. No one needed an explanation of what a slave was, how they lived, or what they feared. Punishments for slaves were brutal. The whip was the most common instrument, but crucifixion was also used. Although Rome preferred to crucify rebellious slaves, especially those who attacked their masters, any slave could face this execution if deemed dangerous. In large cities, such as Caesarea or Jerusalem, slaves could be displayed in public squares with chains or iron collars as a warning. Some were permanently branded with hot iron to indicate they had attempted to escape. Biblical cities: filth, disease, and overcrowding. Biblical cities were much smaller than we might imagine today, but they were also infinitely more chaotic, filthy, and dangerous. Jerusalem, the largest city in Judea, had barely a few thousand inhabitants for much of the first century, although during major festivals its population could multiply temporarily. Despite its modest size, urban life was marked by constant filth, overpowering odors, endemic diseases, and extreme overcrowding. Narrow streets, loose animals, and the complete lack of sanitation turned cities into traps for health, where survival depended as much on luck as on physical endurance. The streets were made of uneven stones or simple layers of hardened earth. There was no efficient drainage system. When it rained, streets became torrents of mud mixed with animal and human waste. Donkey, goat, and sheep droppings accumulated in corners. In low-lying areas, stagnant water attracted flies and mosquitoes, increasing the spread of disease. The smell was constant. Those entering a city from the countryside immediately noticed the difference: a mixture of smoke, sweat, manure, fish, wet leather, and rotting meat. Organized garbage disposal did not exist. Each family threw its waste into ditches or improvised piles outside the city walls, but many people simply discarded trash in the streets. Cities were full of food scraps, bones, shells, broken pottery, and old textiles. Stray dogs scavenged among the refuse and sometimes attacked the weakest. The Book of Psalms and several passages in the New Testament mention these roaming dogs feeding on scraps, reflecting the neglect and urban misery. Drinking water was a luxury. In Jerusalem, for example, the city relied on cisterns that collected rainwater, aqueducts that brought water from kilometers away, and public wells where people gathered daily. But these sources could easily become contaminated. During droughts, water was scarce and families had to ration it strictly. In smaller villages, a single well supplied the entire population. Women formed long lines carrying jars, and if an animal fell in or the water became mixed with sediment, contamination could cause widespread intestinal disease. Overcrowding was extreme. Most houses had a single room where several people slept, sometimes even small animals at night, to protect them from theft. Homes were built so close together that streets resembled narrow corridors between grey walls. The lack of ventilation encouraged respiratory infections. Smoke from domestic ovens filled the air as many households cooked with wood or dung, causing eye irritation, chronic coughing, and lung disease. The Bible frequently mentions smoke as a symbol of burden and suffering, an image resonating with the everyday experience of those living in these densely packed cities. Diseases spread rapidly. The combination of garbage, contaminated water, loose animals, and overcrowding created an ideal environment for epidemics. Fevers, diarrhea, intestinal parasites, and skin diseases were part of daily life. Children rarely reached adolescence without having suffered multiple infections. People with leprosy or contagious diseases were expelled outside the city to avoid spreading illness. They lived in caves or remote camps, relying on the mercy of those who left food for them at the outskirts. This isolation is reflected in biblical accounts where lepers cry out from a distance or must announce themselves with shouts. The market, while vital to the urban economy, was another hotspot of filth. It was set up in squares or main streets where butchers, fishmongers, bakers, tanners, and spice sellers coexisted in constant chaos. Animals were slaughtered on site, and blood flowed between the stalls, mixing with mud. Fish were displayed on wet stones, swarming with flies. Fruits and vegetables were sold on blankets placed directly on the ground. Shouting, bargaining, jostling, and noise created a permanent atmosphere of tension. In this context, protecting merchandise was difficult. A single lapse could result in significant losses. In larger cities such as Jerusalem, Caesarea, or Sepphoris, artisan workshops produced intense odors, dye houses soaking fabrics in natural chemicals, tanneries boiling hides, blacksmiths with constant smoke, and bakeries with ovens running all day. Each contributed its own scent, creating a dense mixture that permeated clothing and hair. Tanners, considered ritually impure, worked in distant areas due to the smell they produced, yet their presence still affected the city when the wind blew in their direction. Public baths existed in Romanized cities, but access depended on social status. In Judea, only cities like Caesarea or Sebasta had Roman-style baths. Ordinary people bathed occasionally in rivers or wells, but personal hygiene remained limited. Hand-washing before meals, mentioned in the Gospels during disputes between the Pharisees and Jesus, was not a widespread practice among all groups, but rather a ritual observance rather than a sanitary measure. At night, cities became even more dangerous. There were no street lamps or public lighting. Streets plunged into darkness, and only those with oil lamps ventured out. In the dark, robberies, assaults, and attacks were common. Fear of spirits, demons, or thieves kept most people indoors after dusk. Only Roman soldiers or temple guards watched over certain strategic areas, yet even they feared narrow streets where attacks could happen with no chance of escape. Cemeteries were located outside the walls due to ritual purity laws. Around them lived marginalized people, beggars, the sick, or spirits according to popular imagination. The Gospels mention the Gerasene demoniac living among the tombs, a story reflecting the popular perception of cemeteries as dangerous places full of impurity and spiritual presence. Jerusalem, though considered holy, was particularly challenging during festivals. The city received tens of thousands of additional pilgrims. Streets became so crowded that walking was difficult. The temple, with its courtyards and markets, was teeming with activity. Priests sacrificed hundreds of animals daily, generating enormous amounts of blood that had to be channeled through special drains. Yet the smell remained uncontrollable. Visitors slept on rooftops, inner courtyards, caves, or even on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. The lack of space caused constant tensions, and thefts increased during these weeks. City walls offered limited protection. Built of large stones, their maintenance was irregular. In times of war, walls could collapse or be scaled. The Romans, experts in sieges, used catapults, battering rams, and mobile towers to force entry. The Great Jewish Revolt of 70 CE demonstrated the vulnerability of cities when the Romans besieged Jerusalem. Hunger, disease, and internal chaos spread rapidly. Although this event occurred decades after the time of Jesus, the fear of sieges was part of the collective memory of all urban inhabitants. Children in the time of Jesus, hard work and high mortality. In biblical times, children's lives were marked by extreme fragility. Being born did not guarantee survival, and surviving did not ensure a childhood free from work, disease, or danger. Infant mortality was so high that each birth was met with both hope and fear. Many children did not survive the first week of life. Others died before reaching 5 years old. The causes were numerous: infections, malnutrition, complicated births, accidents, and diseases that today would be considered minor. In that precarious world, childhood was short and loaded with responsibilities from surprisingly early ages. Birth was always a risky event. Women gave birth at home, assisted by midwives or other women in the family. Without medical knowledge or proper instruments, any complication, such as hemorrhaging, puerperal fever, or prolonged labor, could endanger the lives of both mother and newborn. If the baby was weak or premature, survival chances were drastically reduced. There were no incubators or specialized treatments. The Bible reflects the anxiety associated with childbirth in stories like that of Rachel, who dies giving birth to Benjamin, a reminder of the delicate line between life and death. Once born, the baby was wrapped in tight cloths, secured with swaddling bands, a practice mentioned even in the account of Jesus' birth. This not only provided warmth, but was believed to help strengthen the bones. However, this practice could restrict the newborn's mobility and promote skin infections if the bindings were not changed regularly. Homes, small and dark, were filled with smoke from ovens, accumulated dust, and domestic animals, creating an unhealthy environment for any vulnerable child. Feeding largely depended on the mother. Breastfeeding was essential for infant survival, but if the mother became ill, died during childbirth, or could not produce enough milk, the baby faced an uncertain fate. The lack of safe alternatives made hunger a constant threat. In some cases, wet nurses were used, as mentioned in several biblical stories, but this was a resource available only to wealthy families or in exceptional situations. Poor children did not have this option. As children grew, new dangers emerged. Intestinal diseases were common due to the lack of clean water and unsanitary living conditions. Severe diarrhea killed thousands of children each year, weakened by dehydration. Fevers, colds, and respiratory infections spread easily in tiny houses where multiple people slept together. Insects, intestinal parasites, and lice were inevitable parts of childhood. The combination of poor nutrition, physical labor, and recurrent illness weakened children's bodies and drastically reduced life expectancy. Accidents were another frequent cause of childhood mortality. Uneven streets, open fires, clay ovens, and loose animals created an environment full of hazards. A child could fall into a well, scald themselves with hot water, be bitten by a dog, or be crushed by a pack animal. Tragedies were common and rarely preventable. In a world without hospitals or first aid, any accident could be fatal. Families and communities mourned but carried on, accustomed to living alongside death. Formal education, as we understand it today, was practically non-existent. Children learned by observing adults and participating in household tasks. Boys began working at 5 or 6 years old, helping their fathers in the fields, in fishing, carpentry workshops, or animal husbandry. Their work was not symbolic. It was necessary for household survival. The Bible repeatedly emphasizes the importance of instructing children in the law of the Lord, indicating that religious education was fundamental. In synagogues, some children learned to read passages from the Torah, but this was a privilege not available to all. Girls, meanwhile, assumed domestic duties from a very young age. They helped grind grain, carry water, weave, cook, and care for younger siblings. Female childhood was marked by early preparation for marriage, which could begin as soon as adolescence. Girls were taught to obey, remain humble, and fear God according to the norms of the time. They had no access to formal education and lived under strict rules limiting their freedom. Discipline was severe. Parents exercised absolute authority over their children and used corporal punishment as a teaching method. Wisdom texts in the Old Testament mention the rod as a symbol of correction, reflecting an educational model based on fear and obedience. Life demanded early maturity. Survival left no room for a prolonged or protected childhood. In cities, children also participated in commercial activities. Some worked as street vendors, carrying goods or helping in shops. Others collected trash or food scraps to feed animals or sell. Urban poverty forced families to use every available pair of hands. Children roamed crowded streets, dodging animals, merchants, and soldiers. They were exposed to accidents, disease, and exploitation. Vulnerability was total. Slave children lived under even harsher conditions. They could be sold to unfamiliar households, used as servants, shepherds, or field workers, and subjected to severe punishments with no possibility of defense. Their lives depended entirely on their owners. They had no childhood, they had forced labor. Many were permanently separated from their families. Flavius Josephus mentions cases of children sold due to family debts, a fate that destroyed household unity and condemned the child to a hopeless existence. Child mortality was so common that families developed a particular relationship with it. Mourning was brief, not for lack of love, but out of emotional necessity. Life went on because it had to. In the Gospels, Jesus shows special sensitivity toward children, blessing them and recognizing their spiritual value. These scenes resonated deeply in a society where every surviving child was seen as a small miracle. Male youth faced their own cycle of risk. Adolescent boys were sent to the fields, to fish, or to perform dangerous tasks unsupervised. Physical strength was valued and work intensified as they grew. Adolescence was experienced as a direct transition into adult responsibilities. At 13, a Jewish boy celebrated the passage to religious adulthood, an event equivalent to the modern bar mitzvah, though in the 1st century it did not exist in its current formalized form, and from then on he was considered responsible for following the law. This responsibility, however, did not increase safety. The world remained as dangerous as ever. For children in Galilee, life revolved around the lake and family trades. Many learned to fish before they could read. They accompanied their parents on boats, facing storms and grueling days. In Judea, rural children worked in stony fields under the sun, lifting loads heavier than their own weight. Childhood was a continuous training for a harsh life, a period of accelerated adaptation that tolerated no weakness. The lack of adequate medical care worsened every situation. A simple dental infection, a fever, or a poorly treated wound could lead to fatal complications. Parents did what they could with available resources, ointments, herbs, prayers, and home care, but often nothing was enough. Childhood suffering was an inescapable part of life.